Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Attaining Corporate and Philanthropic Support During COVID-19. For those of you who are returning Candid webinar participants, a warm welcome back. And to those of you who are here for the first time, I'm so glad that you're joining us today. My name is Elizabeth Savella, Program Specialist for Candid, based in our New York Learning Center, and I'll be supporting today's webinar by managing polls as well as collecting questions that you ask along the way and posing them during the Q&A. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, I want to share with you that Candid is celebrating its anniversary. Last year, GuideStar and Foundation Center came together to form a new single organization called Candid. Together, we have over 88 years of experience in the nonprofit sector. Every year, millions of nonprofits spend trillions of dollars around the world. Candid finds out where that money comes from, where it goes, and why it matters. Through research, collaboration, and training, Candid connects people who want to change the world with the resources that they need to do it. Given the current situation, we are increasing our online programming so we can continue to serve you. We recognize that nonprofits are facing challenging times. As a nonprofit, Candid is feeling it too. Therefore, we are redoubling our efforts to share resources and information that will help us get through this crisis together. This webinar is one of the many programs that have resulted from our efforts at Candid to better serve you.
I would now like to introduce our panel for today. We have Supriya Kumar, one of our colleagues here at Candid, who's on our global partnerships team. We also have Molly Weinstein joining us from Common Impact. And we've also invited Caitlin Fitzgerald to join us to talk on the work that Good 360 has been doing to respond to the current crisis. At this point, I'm actually going to pass over the presentation controls to my colleague Supriya to kick off today's conversation. And Supriya, you should be able to advance the presentation now.
Great, thanks, Elizabeth. So I thought I would start this presentation looking at how philanthropy has responded to disasters in the past so that we can see what lessons we can take from previous disasters. But don't worry, I know everyone here is really interested in how philanthropy is responding currently, so I will be diving into what current funding data is also telling us and how you can use that for your work. Every year, Candid actually works in partnership with the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, and we analyze disaster giving data to understand how much money is flowing for disaster preparedness, response, and long-term recovery. Because we collect a majority of our data from the IRS, there usually is a little bit of a lag time between when we can have a complete data set to do the analysis, which is why our latest research report, which was released late last year, focuses on 2017 data, which is what I'll be briefly talking about. Again, I don't want to spend too much time discussing what happened in 2017, but I did want to highlight some key data points that we saw, which can hopefully provide some insights and contrasts to how philanthropy is responding to our current crisis. You might not remember, since 2017 seems like what, it was like 10 years ago now, but it actually was a big year for disasters with major Atlantic hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria causing widespread devastation across the US and the Caribbean. In 2017, we actually identified $504 million in funding for disasters and humanitarian crisis. And this was a pretty large figure in terms of how much money usually goes for disasters. And this is based on Candid's publishing database. As you'll notice from the slide, half of that total disaster-related giving in 2017 went towards storms, which again is not surprising since many funders were responding to the damage caused by hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. So this really shows how philanthropy can really jump into action after major disasters strike. This next slide shows how disaster assistance and disaster strategies are given money. The largest proportion of foundation funding you'll see here, 64%, went to response and relief efforts. I just want to spend a bit of time here so the slide can really sink in. Only 17% of disaster giving in 2017 went toward reconstruction and recovery, and only 2% each went towards resilience measures and disaster preparedness measures. And although this data is only from 2017, this is actually a pretty similar picture we see year in as especially in the current situation, which I'll speak on later. But most of the money that we see coming in comes quickly in response, and very few of that money, very little of that money goes to preparedness and long-term recovery. Right now, we're only just starting to consider the longer-term impacts of COVID-19 on the economy. So it really will be an important place where philanthropy can provide support. And as we all know, with hurricane season approaching soon, philanthropy can also play a part in preparing communities that might already be really hard hit by the coronavirus. Of course, we won't really know until later when we see the data, the extent to which philanthropy steps in, but we at Candid will continue to collect as much real-time data as possible so that we can provide that insight and hopefully the field can learn from what is happening on the ground. We also looked at corporate giving in 2017. Since responding to disasters is such an enormous task, no single sector can really accomplish it on its own. And we have seen corporations step in when disasters strike. In 2017, we identified at least $275 million in grants from corporate giving programs. Once again, you'll see how the majority of the dollars went toward hurricanes. This giving often also comes in-kind support, and we have seen many corporations providing protective equipment and other materials as they respond to COVID-19 currently. I will quickly just mention that all the data that I quickly ran through and more can be found on one of our free websites and funding maps, measuring the state of disaster philanthropy. This map allows users to interact with data based on their specific areas of interest and also allows you to visualize where funding is going. I really encourage everyone to visit the site to see how funders have responded to disasters in the past, as well as see how funders are currently responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. You can also filter by specific regions or specific topic areas so that you can try and identify funders who are working where you are working. So what are we seeing so far in how philanthropy is responding to the current coronavirus crisis? So when we finalized the slides yesterday, we had about $8.3 billion through almost 2,000 pledges and commitments coming through specifically for COVID-19. Now, if you remember my previous slide from 2017, that was about $504 million total for the year. And we're already over an 8 billion figure. So you can see how philanthropy has been quickly mobilizing to respond to the current crisis. Again, this number is updated on a daily basis. So if you check back into today, you'll see a different number, and we're continuing to update the number as best we can. These figures are actually primarily from US foundations, companies, and notable individuals, but we're also working hard to capture the most complete picture of international funding and local fundraising campaigns related to the immediate and long-term effects of the pandemic as well. As Elizabeth mentioned, we also have a number of online tools that nonprofits and philanthropy can use to help them with their work currently. If you're a nonprofit, in addition to the funding summary, our website is also updated regularly with available RFPs and funds hosted across the US. So I do recommend taking a look when you have a chance. The site actually allows you to filter by geographic region, so you can find funds and RFPs located within your region. You can also use a keyword search function so that you can filter through, I believe we have about 574 funds currently on our list. Again, most of these funds are located in the US, but we're continuing to increase our global platform, and hopefully we'll have international funds on there listed soon. And again, as Elizabeth mentioned, we have plenty of online trainings like this one that you're tuning into now on how nonprofits can really navigate fundraising during these times. And if you can't listen to these recordings live, we're also giving access to recordings later on. And then I think the other thing I'd just like to quickly touch on is the site also includes a funding map, which you can dive into to see specifically, look at the grants and pledge data a bit more closely. So if you were to navigate to the funding map, this is the screen that you'll be seeing. And it'll allow you to look at grants by location. So for example, you can toggle to see where funding is going by general location. So if I was to type in China, as this example shows, then you could narrow down to look at how much money is actually flowing to China and which organizations there are getting support. You can also filter by subject area. As we all know, this pandemic is impacting all sectors, and support is flowing not only to healthcare-related organizations, but also to education efforts in arts and culture. So if you are a funder or a nonprofit who's working in the arts, for example, you can actually use this map to see who has been supporting the arts in these times. You know, we're seeing museums having to close, we're seeing artists in need of financial assistance. This allows you to filter so that you can see which funders are out there are making grants to that specific topic. And if you click on the list area view right there, you can actually, that's where you can actually delve into the details. So for example, you can see here that the Minneapolis Foundation has donated to an organization to provide support for local artists and art teachers in relation to the pandemic. I will just reiterate that this funding map, along with all of the other resources, are free and open to the public. So I do encourage that when you have time after this webinar to play around with it and see how it can support your work. As a nonprofit, you'll be able to identify funders who are working specifically either in your topic area or your region. And if you're a funder and you don't see your grants data listed here, please do reach out to us and make sure we get your data so that the map is up to date and it provides the most comprehensive picture of how funding for COVID-19 is evolving.
As Elizabeth mentioned, my name is Molly Weinstein, and I am the Associate Director of Field Building with Common Impact. Common Impact is a nonprofit organization that was founded in 2000 with the purpose of building capacity in the nonprofit sector so that we all can do what we do best, serving our communities. At the time, we recognized that our sector has a critical gap in our ability to resource core business functions. The marketing, the finance, the technology, the HR, all of those functions that make a business run. As you all know, since this is your day-to-day reality, we have precious few resources to dedicate to those core infrastructure functions. On average, we see nonprofits spend about 2 to 8% of our budget in these arenas. And currently there is a fantastic discussions being had in the philanthropy space and some real advocacy to open up more unrestricted, more general operating funds. And actually, I've been really inspired and encouraged to see just over the past couple months that dialogue really accelerating in light of this crisis. That said, back when Common Impact was founded about 20 years ago, that conversation was very nascent in the philanthropy space. So we really started to think creatively about what other resources could we bring to the nonprofit sector to support organizations in building their capacity. And we recognized that the corporate sector has a large, well-resourced and sophisticated workforce in all of these arenas. So what Common Impact does is we run skills-based volunteering or pro bono programs. And I'll use those terms interchangeably over the course of our time today. And these programs align corporate volunteers' service activities with the tasks or issues they are most qualified to address. So the idea is that by sending a technologist out to build a database or a marketer out to create a PR plan, we are getting those individuals where they can be most valuable to your organization. And in our 2 decades of running this work, we've seen transformative impact from these partnerships, not just because we are able to provide nonprofits with the databases, the strategic plans, the communication strategies, those hard to fund projects, but furthermore, we've seen that by knitting together the skills of the corporate and the nonprofit sector employees, we're seeing innovative solutions being created. We are seeing shared perspectives being formed, and essentially what emerges is something that is greater than the sum of its parts. So during this crisis where nonprofits are being called upon more than ever to modify and scale their services during a time of financial duress, we really see skills-based volunteers as a potential lifeline for organizations that are being asked to add 1 and 1 and get to that number 11. Common Impact first started thinking about skills-based volunteerism as a tool to support emergency and disaster response actually well before the current COVID-19 crisis began. The past 3 years have seen an uptick in natural disasters across the globe and in our country in the US, where communities have been battered by hurricanes, wildfires, floods, mudslides, as well as an increase in man-made disasters, with increasing mass shootings, the expanding lead water crisis, the detention of immigrant communities on our southern border, and with the growing threat of climate change, as well as deepening political polarization, we can only expect these challenges to increase, which really creates a more acute need for our communities to come together creatively and collaboratively to respond. And of course, we are seeing this on full display today as we're in the midst of combating a global pandemic as well as its economic implications. And while this pandemic has been dubbed a great equalizer, it's not. We are all being affected, but as we know by working with our constituents, this public health crisis is already disproportionately impacting populations that had, prior to its arrival, been facing discrimination, been combating a lack of access to services, and been dealing with economic hardship long before this crisis hit. So what COVID-19 has done is expose the fault lines that already existed in our society and the wounds that already needed healing. This is a grim picture to paint. However, a bright spot from where I sit has been observing the tremendous efforts being achieved by organizations like you, the organizations that are lifelines and trusted resources for these populations that are inordinately affected by the disaster. So today, we're going to talk a bit about how you can get the resources you need to keep your organizations afloat and in a position to scale and innovate your services to meet the needs of the current moment, as well as we hope of future disasters, man-made, natural, or economic. And so Priya spoke a bit about the state of financial resources available to you all, and I'm going to focus on Common Impact's bread and butter, skilled volunteers, and specifically skilled volunteers from the corporate sector as a large contributor of pro bono support. American companies are increasingly central to the conversation when it comes to disaster response and recovery, and that's been a real transformation over the past several years. In 2000, fewer than 1/3 of the world's largest companies donated anything to disaster relief, and by 2015, that share had surpassed 90%, with the average donation having increased tenfold. And in response to coronavirus, we are seeing tremendous force from the corporate community. I actually earlier today went on that resource map that Supriya shared and filtered that data by corporate giving programs and company foundations, and saw that of the 8.3 billion gifts logged, 5.5 billion is coming from those corporate giving programs or company foundations. And we've not yet quantified the value of in-kind donations and volunteerism as well. The reason for this significant and powerful corporate involvement is multifaceted. Certainly, first and foremost, companies are motivated because it is the right thing to do, full stop. It is becoming increasingly evident, particularly in universal crises like this one, how disasters can decimate our communities, and these are communities which our companies call home and are compelled to help. That said, in addition to this altruistic motive, it's also becoming abundantly clear how interconnected the health of our communities is to the health of our companies. The economic and social health of regions affected by disaster directly affect businesses' ability to continue operations. We're seeing that on a massive and alarming scale with the current crisis. And furthermore, consumers and employees are increasingly insisting that brands take action on social and environmental issues. So the companies which want to be competitive as employers and as brands are realizing that it is a business imperative for them to engage with community disaster response and to do so in an authentic way that does justice to the complexity of disaster impacts. In the world of corporate social responsibility, we can sometimes be a little shy about talking about this full suite of drivers, since we do not want the business imperative to detract from what is a very real altruistic motivation. But I think it's very helpful to start with this full value proposition for investing in community resiliency, particularly as you all may be forging new or expanding existing partnerships with companies. All this being said, what we're seeing in terms of where corporate support is going is very much in line with the pattern that Supriya mentioned. While companies are investing in disaster response, the vast majority of their support has historically been reactive, meaning it is spurred by the occurrence of a disaster. Companies have been very quick to provide funding and launch employee donation drives when disaster strikes, but these efforts often only address immediate relief needs. And to put some time bounds around this, the Hilton Foundation did a study that found that 70% of giving occurs within the 2 months after a disaster strikes. And this focus is not necessarily surprising. We are all, as humans, most galvanized to take action after we are exposed to the devastating effects of a disaster. That is intuitive. And this oversight or investment in relief and underinvestment in preparedness is something that traverses across sectors. Government, nonprofits, and companies are all no exceptions to this. But what we are seeing is that it has created and perpetuated a real preparedness gap. And today we are seeing some of the results of that underinvestment in preparedness infrastructure and equity. This is ultimately compounding the needs emerging from this crisis. And I copied in here a quote that I actually heard on a webinar I attended from Crystal Haling of the Libra Foundation, which I think speaks very articulately to how this underinvestment has perpetuated the current crisis we're experiencing. Looking a little more closely at the nonprofit sector, studies show that roughly 50% of organizations, often some studies have cited more, lack a continuity of operations plan in the event of an emergency. So that is a challenging thing to contend with at a time like this, where our organizations may not have a plan for continuity of operations, and meanwhile we are being asked to scale those operations 2 to 3 times their traditional volume with fewer resources. So I'm now gonna shift to skills-based volunteerism as a solution. And as we look at how to build resilience now in the face of this crisis, and we hope more proactively in the future, skills-based volunteerism is emerging as a particularly strong method. So I'm gonna share a little bit over the next few slides what this could look like and point to some resources to get you started. I will note that Common Impact published a report Last year, in 2019, based on our research into this very domain, nonprofits' preparedness needs when it comes to disaster, as well as the corporate community's response. And that report shares the culmination of our research, as well as some really actionable tools. So while it was created before the current moment, I think that you will find it resonates, and that is that link at the bottom of this page. And I would encourage you to check it out for more context. But I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our suggestions for what this might look like now, and then provide some examples. The first point I want to mention is building off of that dynamic I just described in regards to a preparedness gap. That gap exists, and we find that companies are uniquely positioned to fill that gap through skills-based volunteerism. And why this is the case is while philanthropy has largely been responsive, companies have actually been incredibly proactive when looking at their own business operations and have put a lot of thought and investment into reducing their own business risk in the face of disasters. We are seeing increasing corporate expertise and full departments dedicated to key disaster-related functions, such as business continuity, risk management, assembly line innovation, scenario planning, etc. And as companies are increasing their own preparedness and resiliency, and you may see where I'm going with this, these are the very same skill sets that right now we as nonprofits are needing as we try to prepare to weather what is going to be a protracted crisis. I would call out that normally when we are talking about skills-based volunteerism for disasters, we are advocating fervently for doing this work before a disaster strikes. And we do not have that luxury right now. One thing I've been reflecting on that makes this crisis so challenging is that we as organizations are almost simultaneously needing to prepare and mitigate this crisis while we are also responding, given its acute but also protracted nature. That being said, many of your organizations are in planning mode. As we look out 1 to 6 months, years down the line, we are looking into how this will affect our organization. And those skill sets that I mentioned that many companies have in-house can be incredibly helpful to you as you do so. This second point, however, speaks to the fact that many of us are experiencing acute and urgent needs, and I have been thinking a lot, like many of you, about my Psychology 101 class where we learned Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Many of our organizations are needing to address most basic urgent needs first before we do move into that planning for longer term solvency and stability. Skills-based volunteerism can be a resource for both of these types of needs, yet it will take a different form. So it's important to think through which needs you need to address first, because you do not want to bring in a volunteer to develop out your database if you are still figuring out if you are going to be paying those database fees down the line. For those acute needs, you can think about quick hit models of skills-based volunteerism. So what are those immediate nuggets of knowledge or expertise that you need to move forwards on a core challenge? Often the best way to get this expertise is via what we at Common Impact call a hotline model, wherein you may call up a corporate expert for a quick consultation that allows you to move forwards with a project. For organizations that perhaps are anticipating long-term effects, but whose operations have not yet been radically disrupted right now, this could be a good time to take on those longer-term planning and capacity building projects, which would open you up to models of skills-based volunteerism that bring on individual or teams of volunteers for longer-term collaboration and implementation, really focusing on some of those infrastructure capacity building needs that you anticipate will be critical in the near and long-term future. I should add that as you are thinking about your triage order of operations, if you will, we'd encourage you to think about skills-based volunteerism alongside philanthropy and in-kind donations and hands-on volunteers. And that's part of why we've brought together all of these parties on the conversation today, thinking through what types of undertakings do I simply need cash for? Cash will always be king in some domains. What types of projects do I just need pure manpower for? I could use hands-on volunteers as opposed to a particular skill set. What needs could be addressed with a particular donation of technology or equipment? The most strategic organizations at this time are going to be pulling from a mix of all of these resources, and it's important to know why you're reaching out for one or the other. Now, this third point really builds on that argument, and essentially what we're advocating for here is asking for what you need. Many companies in particular will be able to provide you multiple forms of support, though they may not intuitively think to if you have historically been just a grantee. So being able to articulate to them what you need in terms of funding, in terms of product, and in terms of skill set can really open the aperture on that conversation and reframe the dimension so that it is a needs-based conversation. The more directive but expansive you can be with your asks of prospective partners, the more likely they will be able to support you in the areas you need. And ultimately, you are the expert, not only on your own organization's operations, but also on your mission area. We as nonprofits understand intimately how this crisis is affecting the populations we serve, and we are in a position to be an advisor to prospective donors and to companies about what type of support would help us best serve those needs. So I would encourage you all, as you're marinating on some of the information that we shared today, to think about how you might be able to leverage that expertise in your conversations with prospective supporters to really advocate for a differentiated and holistic set of resources that might help you at this time. Now, what might skills-based volunteerism look like? The good news is that skills-based volunteerism is easy to access virtually. And we're seeing that particularly as individuals are less able to easily volunteer in person, there's a spike of interest in virtual skills-based offerings. In New York, where I live and work, for example, we have seen an inspiring increase in virtual volunteers to the tune of 288%. So there's increasing interest in this and a few different forms it can take. Virtual education is essentially taking the idea of a webinar or a workshop and providing that to nonprofit organizations by experts who are seasoned in a particular area, such as financial scenario planning or crisis communications. We are seeing many companies as well as nonprofits providing this for the nonprofit sector. The hotline model I mentioned, similar to the way we as nonprofits often access pro bono counsel, The idea of the hotline model is being able to call up an expert in an area such as risk management and have them answer those quick, time-sensitive questions that will allow us as nonprofit leaders to move forward on a challenge. This is a very low-hanging fruit model that we're seeing real interest in from companies as well as from individuals. So something to consider when you're thinking broadly about your network, who might be an expert that you could call up. The virtual day of service model takes the idea of a traditional day of service with two big distinctions. One, rather than volunteering to paint a fence or build a home, volunteers are working on a discrete capacity building project, developing a set of crisis talking points, updating a web page, maybe developing a set of remote work best practices. The other distinction is this is taking place virtually. So typically volunteer teams will work together over a few hours and produce a deliverable that your organization can then implement. Often intermediaries like Common Impact are the organizations that are running this with companies, and many companies who previously offered an in-person event-based hackathon model are looking into how to now move this online. Finally, team consulting. And what I'm talking about here are those longer-term capacity building projects, often completed with a team, though could also be an individual. These are those projects that last 6 weeks to 6 months, in which volunteers will be working on a more substantive project, like revising your growth strategy in light of the current crisis, developing out financial models, developing a robust PR strategy and resources for the current moment. So as you can see, there's a real diversity of ways to engage volunteers, and what you might engage them on depends on your organization's needs. And what I've done here is sliced these projects very, very roughly by some of the needs we're seeing emerge by different types of organizations. For groups that are being asked to ramp up their services, but had previously depended on a volunteer workforce that is no longer available, we are hearing needs in quantifying what was the value of that volunteer workforce and how do we make up for that by advocating for financial investment in kind donations or adjusting our operations. How do we even wrap our heads around that while we are in triage mode? How are we developing plans and the competency to make sure that our volunteers are following the latest health guidelines, and how do we market that in a time when there is fear and perhaps reticence on the part of volunteers? For groups like human services organizations, I saw we have a number today, like domestic violence organizations whose models are premised on being in person, but who are dealing with increased and very complex needs. Projects like understanding what a surge in need will mean for your organization and really modeling out what resources you'll need to meet that. Innovating on the way you're delivering your products and your services so that you are able to reach hard to reach clients in a virtual way. For organizations perhaps like the arts and culture organizations on the line who may be going into more of a hibernation mode right now, this may be a great time for you all to start to think about that long-term planning. How, when we emerge from this, are we going to get our organization up and running? What are the different financial scenarios? How are we communicating with our donors, with our constituents about what we're continuing to do, why arts and culture remain critical to the fabric of our communities? So this is just a sampling, and I'm going to point you to a place where you can access some more examples, though hopefully I've gotten some gears turning on prospective ways you might engage volunteers. All of the tools that I'm going to mention on this slide live on Capacity Commons, and the URL is listed at the bottom. It is capacitycommons.org. This platform is Common Impact's free one-stop shop for skills-based volunteerism. It is a website that provides really the A to Z of pro bono, allowing you as an organization to both learn about it, think about how you might approach it, what your needs would be, scope out projects, find volunteers, and run them. So there is a treasure trove of resources on this site. However, we have recognizing that the current crisis places increased urgency and expediency on getting projects up and running. We've collated a page of resources specifically to support you during this time. These include more examples of projects that you might consider, spanning both traditional capacity building projects, which may be more critical than ever at this time, as well as some projects specific to disaster response. We've also provided for you a brief self-assessment that organizations can take to help identify areas where your organization may have really strong resiliency in place and areas that might be more vulnerable. And this is geared to help you prioritize amongst many needs as you're thinking about what skills-based volunteers could support. We also point you to an interactive scoping tool, as we call it, which is essentially a tool that allows you to define and outline a skills-based volunteering project in a thoughtful, comprehensive, but digestible way. A great tool to help you get your arms around what it is you want to tackle, and also to bring to prospective corporate or individual volunteers really as a proposal for something to tackle together. And finally, we offer direction to some potential skills-based resources. This includes a connection to some virtual aggregators, essentially match.coms for skilled volunteers, as well as support in identifying who amongst a corporate, a regional, or your own individual network might be sources of skilled volunteers. So I'm going to pass it back over to Elizabeth, who will segue into Good 360's presentation, but similar to Supriya would mention that there is a lot of resources that we've listed out here, and I'm also happy to take questions towards the end of our presentation and to follow up to support you all as you're thinking about skilled volunteers as a resource during the current crisis and beyond.
Thank you so much, Molly. I appreciate you taking us through all of those various resources here. We are getting plenty of questions coming in. We do see them, but please continue to submit them for our Q&A. With that, Caitlin, the presentation is yours.
All right, hello everyone. Want to start off by saying thank you so much to Candid for bringing us together and hosting this webinar. And thank you as well to everyone who was able to make it today and hasn't yet dropped off for a 3 p.m. meeting. I know everyone has full calendars and inboxes, so I hope that some of the information that I'll be sharing today on how Good 360 facilitates in-kind giving and the best practices that we have for grant funding will be helpful for you all going forward in navigating this strange new world we currently find ourselves in. And I'm sure, like me, a lot of you are working from home, and I apologize for any rogue leaf blowers or lawn mowers that might choose to make an appearance in the background. Again, my name is Caitlin Fitzgerald, and I am the manager of disaster recovery at Good 360. My role is to be the liaison between nonprofits who are responding to disasters and the corporations who are looking to provide needed goods to the disaster space. I work in tandem with my colleague, Jim Alvey, and together we are the disaster recovery dynamic duo at Good 360. Jim works closely with our donor base to help them navigate disaster giving, and I work directly with the nonprofit network to make sure the donations Jim procures make it to our nonprofit partners on the ground. We've often been referred to as the biggest nonprofit you've never heard of. This is a label we are determined to correct, but nonetheless, I'll begin with some background information on Good 360 to give you a better idea of who we are and what we do for those who might not have heard of us before today. Good 360 was established just over 37 years ago as a solution for companies to resolve the business challenge of responsibly distributing excess goods for maximum impact in their communities. In addressing this challenge among our donors, in turn, we've been able to help our nonprofit partners deliver on their own missions. The Good 360 model enables nonprofits to get the goods they need. Thus, products are given a new life, which helps reduce waste and build resilient communities across the country. To put it simply, Good 360 is the connector or matchmaker, as we like to say, between corporations with product to donate and nonprofits who can best utilize that product. Over the years, Good 360 has built a network of over 400 donor companies to help transform the lives of people and communities in need by developing a variety of donation programs that have helped our donors donate over $9 billion in donated goods efficiently and effectively to our network of more than 90,000 vetted nonprofits. This slide shows just a handful of members of the diverse donor base that we have built to meet the needs of our nonprofit network. In partnerships with companies like Walmart, Amazon, Nike, Advanced Auto Parts, Bed Bath & Beyond, and many others, we have developed a suite of programs to fit the equally diverse needs of our nonprofits. These programs include our online catalog, which acts just like any online shopping website, provides nonprofits access to goods at the carton and pallet level. Our direct truckload donations, which are full 53-foot truckloads of donations and typically come directly from distribution centers of our donors. Our retail matching program, which allows nonprofits to pick up donations from their local stores like Walmart, Bed Bath & Beyond. And of course, there's our disaster recovery program. While our other programs have been active for many years, in comparison, our disaster recovery program is relatively young. It was about 4 years ago when we realized that a good portion of our nonprofit network was dealing with their normal operations on top of responding to the devastation of a disaster in their community. It was clear that we were in a perfect position to fill the gap in product needs on the disaster field, and it was a natural transition for us to add disaster recovery to our wheelhouse. Over the course of the past 4 years, we've responded to 40 disasters, starting with a devastating flooding event in West Virginia in 2016, to most recently the tornadoes throughout the Southeast, and of course, COVID-19. To date, we've sent over $90 million in critically needed goods, from first response products such as solar lights, hygiene kits, and cleaning supplies, all the way through the long-term recovery with shingles, flooring, mattresses, and furniture. We have navigated the disaster space and started to become more familiar with the dynamic challenges that came along with it, and we realized that there was a glaring issue with in-kind donations and how they were being sent to disaster-affected people and regions. To reiterate what my co-panelists have brought up as well, when a disaster strikes, data shows that 70% of giving happens within those first 2 months of it striking, and over 60% of all the in-kind donations that occur ultimately end up in a landfill due to it being the wrong product at the wrong time of the disaster recovery cycle. This looks like a mattress being sent to a disaster field a week after a hurricane hits, and it's sitting in a warehouse growing mold and eventually having to be thrown away. Additionally, only 5% of giving during a disaster is allocated towards long-term recovery and rebuilding, which can take multiple years or sometimes up to a decade to complete. If that sounds outrageous to you, last year we helped a nonprofit deliver furniture to a family whose home was just completed rebuilding from damages it incurred from Hurricane Katrina. So over the past 4 years, we have made it part of our mission to bring those challenges into the light and educate our donors on best practices for giving during a disaster in order to reduce those statistics and make sure our nonprofits are only receiving exactly what is needed, when it is needed, and reduce waste and avoid inundating them with unusable product that takes up valuable space and time. Our newest challenge has been navigating our response to COVID-19 to support our donors and our nonprofit network and the first responders involved in this pandemic. As of yesterday, when I updated this data, there were 3 million confirmed cases of COVID-19 in the world, and 990,000 of those being in the United States. But it's been 24 hours since this was updated, so those numbers have lightly increased, but This is a map from Johns Hopkins Institute's COVID-19 dashboard. Some of you, like me, I'm sure, are checking this dashboard on a daily basis. And as you can see, while the majority of the cases are concentrated in large cities, with New York being the most highly affected, cases are spread out from coast to coast. In other words, literally the entire nation has been affected by this disaster. And although we have become well-versed in disaster space, COVID-19, for us, as for most people, has been a different kind of animal. Rather than focusing our efforts on a specific region that has been impacted by a disaster, we are now faced with our entire network being impacted by a disaster that none of us have dealt with before and are doing our best to navigate. The emergence of COVID-19 in the United States has forced us to rethink how we approach disaster response, stretched us to be more nimble in the face of challenges, and how to evaluate how we engage both our nonprofit and donor networks to continue making an impact. Even in the midst of COVID-19, our promise to our donors has not changed. We are continuing to provide every service available to them, and we are fortunate to be able to do that. In fact, we have actually experienced an uptick in in-kind donations from many of our donors. With the decline in shopping and sales, retailers have found themselves with a large amount of excess inventory that needs to be moved. Good360 has been the solution for this problem, while also allowing them to give back to families and communities who have been impacted by COVID-19. With the influx of donated product, Good360 has acted as a thought leader for our donors by helping them identify the best way for them to engage in response effort, whether that be donating product or helping them develop an employee giving program that helps with their employees who feel like they want to do something as well and give back to those in need. We have been able to tap into our vast and diverse nonprofit network, deliver a turnkey solution to their business problems, all while delivering full transparency on where their donations are going and how they are being used to make an impact. We also offer as much visibility as possible to the donor through the use of our social media pictures and providing pictures and feedback on the cycle of donations along with impact stories. A unique way in which we have been able to be a solutions manager for our donors is in helping manufacturers who have converted their practice from using their materials in factories to create masks, and by being the connection to first responders and handling all the logistics to get those masks from the factory directly to those in need. For our nonprofits, our mission to them has been more important than ever. With the stress and uncertainty that has arisen due to COVID-19, we are working very closely with our nonprofit network to identify the evolving needs and making sure that we are consistently updating our donors so that they can be well informed in their decision making on what they are donating. Next, we are connecting our nonprofits with critically needed products that they would otherwise find difficult to access. As you know, there's been a shortage of highly needed items like paper products and personal protection equipment. And admittedly, these products have been difficult for us to come by as well, but we are well positioned to fight on behalf of our nonprofits for those products as they become available. And I've been able to send thus far $2.5 million in needed goods to our nonprofits specifically for their COVID response efforts. We also help leverage their dollars so they can invest more in programs and services, thus helping them make a bigger impact in their community. Good360 guarantees that for every dollar that is spent, we will be able to provide a minimum of $10 in donated goods. This means that nonprofits are able to save on the purchase of needed goods and funnel their funding to other important programs. And finally, we help amplify their impact through efficient distribution channels, helping cover shipping costs and co-writing grant applications. One of the added benefits Good360 brings to the relationship between us and a nonprofit is our ability to tell the story. Many of our strong nonprofit partners are amazing at the tactical groundwork of managing donations and making sure the community is receiving what it needs. But when it comes to grant writing, some find it difficult to communicate just how important their mission is and why they are the best at doing it. Good360 has helped some of our close partners tell their story and leverage their partnership with Good360 to communicate the impact that they are able to make. The fact that for every $1 they receive, they can distribute up to $20 in product makes an attractive argument to funders who would want to make sure that their money is going as far as it can. Everything that we have done to help our donor and nonprofit networks respond to this crisis ties back into what our strategies are for grant funding. I want to start this off by saying that there is no perfect formula. Every nonprofit has to determine what their strengths are, where they lie, and develop a grant funding strategy that shows showcases those strengths to potential partners. But these three things are what we have found to be successful for us over the years and what have enabled us to build long-lasting relationships with funders who believe in what we do and choose to continually invest in it. First, start local. It is easy to approach grant funding opportunities by going after the biggest and most well-known fish first. But in reality, the odds of getting a check from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, fortunately, is pretty low for most of us. We have found the most success by tapping into local foundations who have a vetted interest in specific missions or communities. Whether your nonprofit focuses on the arts, teachers, youth development, first responders, or homelessness, there's likely a foundation in your community who focuses on that as well. There are several grant funding resource websites that can help you find local funders and will tell you what missions they support and how much they typically donate. A few I know we utilize are GrantWatch, GrantSpace, usgrants.org, and Foundation Search. And of course, Candid is always an excellent resource for researching both nonprofit and foundation data across the country. Another local opportunity for funding is to approach your local service providers, such as banks and insurance companies, who usually have discretionary funds set aside to invest in nonprofits in their community. Also, stores like Walmart have local giving initiatives set up where stores are enabled to give $5,000 in grant funds to nonprofits of their choice. You can find more information on Walmart's program online, or if you're feeling bold, you can speak directly to a local store manager. The more personal the connection, the better. Also, if you're a nonprofit who engages in disaster recovery, look into your local VOAD chapter. It's VOAD. VOAD is an acronym for the Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. Every state has their own VOAD chapter, and it is a network of nonprofits who are highly vetted and well-versed in the disaster space. They work together to develop collaborative ways to respond to disaster and make sure that there's no duplication of efforts in the disaster field. The VOAD network is supported by FEMA and the UPS Foundation. Those are two of their biggest funders, and there are occasionally grant opportunities that arise and are open to all members of the VOAD. So if you're eligible, definitely look into that, and you will be updated when those opportunities become available. Next is one of the most straightforward pieces of advice that we can give is always be honest, direct, and genuine when approaching a donor to support your mission. Every nonprofit has a unique mission that was created to solve a specific problem or add value where it is needed in their community. Provide your opportunity to them in a way that makes the mission of your organization invaluable. Think of the grant funder as an investor in your business who is expecting a return on their investment. When applying for grant assistance, ask yourself what unique value you are adding to the community. Communicate the problem you are facing and why your organization is the right organization to fix the problem. As I mentioned before, one way in which Good 360 does this is by offering full transparency on how the funding we receive is utilized and closing the loop on feedback with photos and impact stories that show exactly how their investment improved the lives of those in need. As the saying goes, middle of the disaster is not the right time to be exchanging business cards. Relationship building should go on year-round. In the disaster community, we like to say we build quote-unquote blue sky relationships. It is much easier to network and build deep relationships with stakeholders while you're not both in the midst of a crisis. Once you have reached crisis mode, the instinct of many people is to draw back from new opportunities and stick with what they know. Identify other nonprofits, funders, and resources that you know will want in your back pocket should a disaster occur. Good 360 has spent years proving our mission to companies like CarMax, Booz Allen, CVS, and Ecolab, who have bought into us completely and have chosen to support us consistently. It is not always easy finding and developing those types of relationships, but it's worth the battle to put in the time to develop them and prove that your mission is worth investing in. When you can convince a funder to fund you for your mission as a whole, opposed to a knee-jerk reaction during a crisis, that is when you can start to become more sustainable and prepared for when a crisis does strike. If you are in a position where this is the first crisis you've been engaged in, at this point, I would not recommend reaching out to as many new contacts as you can. Not only are you one in a million other groups who are asking for assistance, but it may also hurt your chances at developing a relationship with them down the line. Instead, consider leveraging as many existing relationships that you have and use them to network for new partners and opportunities. Ask who are their partners or supplier who might be able to fit within your mission. After this crisis starts to abate, take note of the relationships that you wish you would have been able to call on or work with by developing those and showcasing how you were able to respond and what you accomplished. Use the experience you have gained to build partnerships that will make the situation more manageable for you the next time around. Also, don't be afraid to go back to the well. If you have received funding or assistance from a resource in the past, they're the perfect line to tug on. They know you and they've already proven that they believe in your mission enough to invest in it. Another readily available resource that often goes overlooked is your own board. Be willing to push your board to vouch for your mission to their own network. It's their job to support your nonprofit, and they should be the most valuable tool in your arsenal. I won't spend too much time on this since it could easily be its own presentation, but one thing we know for sure is that natural disasters are not going away. And in fact, they've been increasing in frequency and severity over the past few decades. This may not seem relevant since I know the focus and the main problem on everyone's mind has been how to respond to COVID-19. I don't think anyone anticipated that we would be facing the possibility of quarantining into the summer and, God forbid, maybe even into the fall. But now Good 360, other national groups, and local nonprofits in vulnerable regions have started thinking about the looming hurricane season in addition to their COVID-19 response. Many of the resources that would be typically saved for immediate response during the hurricane season are being depleted due to the urgent needs that have risen from COVID-19. Mitigation and preparation for all disasters is something Good 360 has been very diligent about communicating to our donors. We take it so seriously, in fact, that we created a resilient response pledge that is based on 6 key pillars of thoughtful giving to help our donors and make the necessary shift in disaster giving to help impacted communities recover faster. Good 360 has been fortunate to have connections to a wide range of donors who have significant influence over what ends up in the hands of nonprofits, and we believe it would be irresponsible of us to not leverage those connections in order to educate them on how to give thoughtfully to the disaster space in order to expedite recovery rather than hinder it. The 6 tenets of the pledge include being proactive, developing a response plan before a disaster so that response is strategic and not just reactionary. Being needs-based focused by sending only what a community needs, not just what they are able to give. Focus on immediate and long-term recovery. Recovery lasts well after the cameras and media leave, and the majority of the most critical needs arise in the long-term recovery portion. Be resiliency focused and donate with the goal of building stronger communities that are better able to withstand future disasters. Be transparent and deliver on promises and hold ourselves accountable. And focus on education. Share and uphold the best practices of thoughtful giving during a disaster to stakeholders, employees, and customers. Up until recently, we have used the idea of resiliency to communicate our disaster recovery efforts, but what we have realized is that resiliency is ingrained in all of the missions we support year-round, and that has become especially apparent now with our COVID-19 response. Building resiliency is at the forefront of everything we do, and it's what we consistently communicate to our donors as well. With COVID-19 and the upcoming hurricane season, it has become even more important for us to leverage our relationships to ensure donors and nonprofits feel prepared and supported. Collaboration across sectors is the key to building a successful response plan, and I hope some of the information and tools I have shared with you today will inform your planning going forward. If you're not already part of the Good 360 network, I advise that your next step be to register with us so you can stay informed on our activity, as well as filling out the survey on the resource page of this presentation so we can learn more about your COVID-19 efforts and how we might be able to support each other going forward. With that, I'll pass it back and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Caitlin, and thank you to everyone who's still with us here today. We're now going to shift into Q&A. So as we do so, again, just a quick thank you to Supriya, Molly, Caitlin. I really appreciate you walking us through all of the materials for today. We've had plenty of questions come in, so let's go ahead and get started here. Our first question that I wanted to pose to the group here is perhaps something I'll have you address first, but everyone else feel free to jump in. Alexandra wanted to know if you have any insights or tips for nonprofits that are not frontline responders, whether that's environmental education nonprofits such as hers, or other organizations, that we know are definitely being affected, but need to raise money now and the opportunities feel slim.
Yeah, again, I would just reiterate that going local is probably the best course of action for trying to find immediate grant funds. There are a lot of local organizations that are trying to support nonprofits and their diverse missions that are being affected right now. So I would definitely say that I would look within your community and see who is supporting certain missions, also using the resources that I listed, and finding those grant opportunities online. There are plenty of resources that we can send out after this where you can do a search for your specific mission. If it's environmentally focused, you're able to type that in and look within a range of who's in your community that would be interested in supporting that. So as far as funding, that's what I would say. If it's a need for materials, I would say sign up with us, of course, and fill out the survey that we have listed on this presentation, and I'd be happy to get in touch with you as far as that. But funding, I would say definitely use those resources as well as Candid as well to see if there's any local opportunities for you.
Molly, Supriya, anything else to add for organizations that are not frontline responders?
I'll just add that Candid's fund page has now added a keyword search, as I mentioned in my presentation. And I just quickly, looked up environment and saw a few funds showing up. So you can definitely use that to look for specific funds for specific subject areas. And of course, the funding map might also help you with that.
I would merely reinforce Caitlin's point. We, on the volunteerism front, see a very similar dynamic, that it is easiest to form new relationships with groups that have a vested interest either in your mission area or in your locality. So looking at some of those smaller local players or players that have a history of donating to your mission area, we are hearing from many companies and donors that most of them are actually intending on generally sticking with their existing philanthropic pillars. So that fit dimension remains incredibly important. And then on the softer side, there's of course a storytelling element here, being able to articulate perhaps you are not a first responder, but how your organization will be critical to a community's long-term recovery, and giving that funder the kind of needed assurances that you have those plans in place may be helpful.
Great, thank you, ladies. On a similar note here, we have a question that came in from Sarah, and she wants to know if you can speak to strategies that organizations that do not do direct disaster relief, but rather focus on, secondary or second wave relief, might be able to leverage or really look into. She's thinking, mental health, PTSD programming, education, health education, digital infrastructure rebuilding. So folks who are going to need to come in here on kind of this second wave of relief.
I'll chime in, Elizabeth. This is Molly. What I would say, and this is kind of building off my last point, these are the organizations that, to all of the examples you provided, are the groups that ultimately move a community towards recovery. And one of the unfortunate byproducts that we've seen historically with the funding in corporate communities bias towards response is that often these groups, because they come in that second wave, are not the groups that receive an inundation of resources in the time of disaster. I would say how we combat that likely needs to be multi-pronged. It is a challenge. I think one dimension is for known funders who are invested in you, being able to really articulate to them what your role is in that long-term recovery will be critical. And if you are able to articulate that as a strong and comprehensive value proposition, I am thinking, for instance, my perspective is specifically with corporate entities and with volunteerism, but being able to articulate why a mental health mission is, of course, critical to getting our communities in a place where we are again able to make purchases to support that company, to go back to work, kind of all of these functions that are the full cycle of recovery. Being able to articulate that in a way that will resonate with the particular entity you are approaching can help.
Yeah, I would echo that as well, and just make a comment that mental health is one of the areas that is typically overlooked when it comes to a disaster. A lot of people don't think about the emotional well-being issues that come out of going through a disaster like this, and even more so with COVID-19, with people's livelihoods being threatened and just the massive changes people have seen in their own lives over the past couple of months. So I think that if you were to find a funder who'd be willing to support this, they're definitely out there. It just might take a little more research, but it's a really compelling story, and it's a gap in the long-term recovery of this disaster and all disasters, frankly, that needs to be filled. And there needs to be a nonprofit who can step up and say that we have the ability to respond to this, and we know how, and we're the best at doing it. So if you're do your research on any grant funders or foundations who are interested in supporting mental health, or who you think, your own personal connections, who you think might be interested in this side of the story, you have a really good opportunity to bring something to the forefront that most people don't usually think of, but is, you know, when it is brought up, it's like, of course, that is obviously something that needs to be addressed as well, and is a big issue among everyone who's been affected by this. So I think there's definitely opportunities there for a good story to be told.
Thank you so much, ladies. The resources that are currently shown on the screen are available and linked in the PDF version of the presentation, including the survey that Caitlin mentioned, the additional resources in Capacity Commons, as well as the database that Supriya had mentioned at the top of the webinar. I've linked to the PDF version of the presentation. It'll also be included with the recording and the follow-up email, but just letting you know that those resources are available to you. Our next question here comes from Sylvina. And since you're mentioning storytelling here, Molly, I wanted to throw this one to you. As an organization whose work is focused on recovery, what messaging or strategies would you recommend Sylvina and her organization use to ask for that support?
It's a great question, Elizabeth, and I think pulls from some of the themes of our previous answers. Often the most compelling way to articulate this is by connecting the dots for funders or companies who might not be in your space. So to an organization working, and let's continue with the mental health example, that is of course intuitive why that is absolutely critical to be receiving funding at this moment in time. For folks who are outside the space, they're going to need that explanation. So being able to articulate both what you are doing now, either by way of current activities, maintaining current programs, or what you plan to do in the future. And if you're able to get your arm around some of the numbers, either concrete or predictions of what that need will be, that will help. I would also say being able to articulate what your specific need is. It may just be general funding, since many of our organizations have taken a pure financial hit. Or if you are thinking about skills-based volunteerism, you may have a very concrete project portfolio for them. Perhaps you need to figure out how to take your mental health services digital while working with the technology insecure population. That is a complex and very compelling challenge. Being able to articulate why it's important, what it will do for you and for your community, will make that a much more compelling pitch.
Thank you so much, Molly.
Continuing here with our next question, I actually wanted to pose this one to Caitlin. We have a number of folks, including Linnea, who are asking about working with Good 360. Is there a cost associated to the nonprofit, and where could they find more information?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is absolutely no cost to just going to our website and registering, becoming part of our network. And we are a nonprofit as well. So for our core operations, as we call it, everything outside of our disaster recovery operations, we do have a small admin fee for some of those donations. That's just our operating costs, how we keep the lights on, how we bring in and are able to stay activated. So there is a small cost associated with any products that come through that avenue, but on the disaster side, we are getting grant funds from our donors and from foundations. So in many cases, we're able to cover the shipping and handling and operation costs for those donations, but that is also on a case-by-case basis. But the value that our nonprofits get from any product that is purchased from us is cents on the dollar if they would have gone to a Walmart or a large retailer and bought them from them directly. So it is a major discount on any of the products that we have. And if you want to engage with us immediately, you would just have to go and register with us. There is a vetting and compliance process that you would have to go through just to ensure that you're a 501c3 nonprofit. If you are intending to get donations on a truckload level, we also have a process of making sure you have the capabilities of accepting a truck, a warehouse, forklift, loading dock, the proof that you own or the space is donated to you. And then you can go ahead and go on our catalog and take a look at what we have. And then if you are doing COVID-19 response, again, just fill out the survey that we have listed here, and we will get all of your information and what you're doing, what your mission is, what your needs are, and we will be able to reach out to you directly if you're looking for something outside of what we would be able to offer on our catalog. So please feel free to reach out to us there. We would love to hear from everybody and ask any questions that you may have through that survey as well.
The next one that we have here comes from Phoenica. And she says something her team is concerned about is corporations who are responding to COVID. Should her organization expect their non-disaster relief funds to be affected? So for instance, non-COVID grant renewals, sponsorships, matching gifts. Is it common for disaster relief funds to be additional funds beyond what's dedicated as a grant? Supriya, I'll send this one to you and then feel free to redirect to one of our partners if needed.
I don't think that's pretty common, but what I think might be helpful and what we've been noticing is that funders are currently being quite flexible. So a good starting point if you're looking for funding beyond disaster is to, reach out to your funders directly and see if maybe you can either repurpose or extend your current funding, or if you could quickly reapply for additional funding just for general support or any other work you're doing that's non-disaster relief. I'm not quite sure if that answered your question, but hopefully that gives you some way to navigate fundraising during this time, even if it's not purely a disaster focused work.
Molly, I just wanted to know perhaps if the report that Common impacted might speak to this as well, and it's perfectly fine if it didn't. So just wanted to see if you had any additional insights.
I'm not certain, and I don't know that there is a precedent for this as it relates to where those funds are coming from. I would echo what Supriya shared, that from what we are seeing, and this is, at least for my part, somewhat anecdotal, the resources that are being dedicated to COVID-19 are above and beyond what was already planned. I do think there will be a dynamic that this is going to be part of the conversations for a very long time. We will be operating in a post-COVID world, and I think it's yet to be seen what that means in terms of, will these be two separate budgets? Will COVID eclipse other philanthropic priorities? And from where I sit, in the volunteerism domain, how will traditional volunteerism play out in a post-COVID world is a question that we're asking ourselves often. And what we are predicting for that part is an increase in virtual and skills-based volunteerism. Certainly is going to be part of that. So that wasn't a complete answer to your question. I think much of that has yet to be known, and I think it also likely looks different on a funder-to-funder, company-to-company basis, depending on how well resourced they are and the way in which they structure these mechanisms.
Thank you so much. Our next question here comes from Robert, and he wants to know if you have any suggestions on how organizations should tactfully approach companies, who may be, experiencing layoffs and furloughs themselves. I think both, if you have an existing relationship with a corporation, or perhaps, if you've been kind of in conversation with them, but a conversation isn't fully fledged out already, are there any recommendations on how to approach that conversation with a partner or potential partner?
I don't know that there's necessarily a prescription for this other than doing it with grace, of course. I think what we have seen in this moment is tremendous flexibility from funders and from companies, in part because I think one of the interesting dimensions of this crisis is it is relatable to everyone. So organizations are experiencing intimately what it means to be shifting operations online. And for companies who are well resourced to do so, it's not so hard to imagine how that may be harder for nonprofits who do not have as robust a technical infrastructure. So one thing I've been noticing is that there is just a tenor of empathy to every communication these days that I think will help you have those conversations. I think in general, I would start first with known entities. And I know we've all been articulating this, but it will be hard to make headway with someone who is entirely new to you, or with whom you do not have some real commonality of interest, either in mission or in region. If that commonality is there, really leaning on that and articulating, to a point I mentioned in my presentation, companies are really acutely aware that when we talk about community versus company, in many ways, they're one and the same. Their employees are members of these communities. Their employees may be your constituents. So I think being able to really articulate that will help you with new partners. In general, you will make the most headway with folks with whom you already have existing partnerships, or at least an in. So think about, with those existing partnerships, how might we expand these conversations? And the more you can make that less of a transaction and more of a partnership, likely the better that will resonate during a time that is trying for everyone.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of that, but just by saying, again, be genuine and upfront when you're approaching these donors or anyone that you know or are trying to prospect for. Of course, it's better if you have an existing relationship, but anyone you do approach, just everyone wants to be a part of the solution for this. And if you approach it as, we have a solution for fixing a certain problem that has arisen out of this COVID-19 pandemic, and here's how a partnership with your business or company would help bring that solution to fruition. And like Molly said, it becomes a partnership rather than you going to them and just asking for something that you need. Worst thing you can do is act like everything is fine Definitely tie your mission to COVID relief and how you're going to be addressing a specific problem, and try and create a story around what you're doing. And like I said, what we do and what helps us with donors and keeping relationships alive is reporting back to them and saying, this is what we asked for, here's what you gave us, and this is what we were able to do with it. And that can be really powerful for donors, and knowing that and seeing a tangible evidence of what their support was able to accomplish. So any kind of promises or guarantees that you can make in terms of feedback to them and letting them know that we're not just going to take this funding and then you'll never know what happened. Give them a way to check back in with you and see exactly the impact that they were able to make in their partnership with you. And just set realistic expectations. Let them know what your mission is and how they would be able to fit in with that.
Great, thank you so much. For everyone who is still on the line with us, thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. I can't thank Molly, Supriya, and Caitlin enough for sharing their expertise with our audience today. Rest assured, you will receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. It'll also include a link to a short survey, so definitely let us know what you thought of today's session, and please let us know what you want to continue learning about. We are continuing to craft additional online learning opportunities for our audience, so please let us know what is top of mind for you. On behalf of our team here at Candid and our presenters, thank you so much for joining us today. If you like this webinar, we do hope that you join us again soon. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone, and stay safe.